Let's talk about exposure in images, which is exceptionally important, especially if you want to print something. If you're gonna go to Photoshop and look at histogram here on the top, and if you don't see that, you can always turn it on. You can also see histogram here under camera raw. So if you go to camera raw, once you load in your TIFF, so your raw image, so here you can check if you don't clip any tones. So the left hand side of the histogram, right, is black tones, and the right hand side is bright tones. Anytime your histogram is touching the left or right wall, you're most likely either underexposing or you're overexposing things. And you will see that if you click on these two squares here, you can actually see clipped areas. Clipped areas will have no detail. So when you print that, for example, you will basically see pure black color. And trust me, you don't want that in prints. But also you don't want that in TIFFs that, came out of the render engine, because you want them to be edited. So you want to have something to work with that actually gives you a bit of a leeway in terms of adding contrast, etc. Okay? So you don't want clipped images either way. What you want is an image that basically doesn't touch either of these sides. Okay? So a well-exposed image will basically have no clipping to the left or right of the histogram. Okay? Now, what you need to be careful about is few things. First of all, you need to be very careful about reflections, because reflections can be very, very strong in terms of highlights. So when you render something, make sure that the light reflecting from a surface, right? Like for example, we have here. So let me just grab a brush. So, reflections like for example in these areas, right? They will be strong. You need to kind of dial them down. So what you can do in Blender, right, when you have material, you can go to matte settings and you can up the roughness. It will basically dial down the reflections, right? You could always, if you have a clear code, you could up the clear code roughness, right? You could also change the specularity of your object, drop it down a bit, especially on metallic stuff, right? You need to be really careful. So when you have a hard light, remember we talked about soft light and hard light. When you have hard light, that is specifically dangerous in terms of reflections, because they're going to be very, very bright. So always watch the histogram. So when I render something, right, when I render an image, I bring it to the Photoshop, and the first thing I check is the histogram. If I clip the image, right, then I go back to Blender and I re-render this with new light settings. Now, the simplest way of fixing the problem, if your image is a bit too dark and you're using HDRI, is to basically bump this to like 1.2 or 1.5, especially when you're using overcast images, like for example, abandoned slipaway. It's going to pump up, a bit more light into the scene and open the shadows. You could use reflectors like I showed you before. There are other tricks you can use here, and I'll be talking about it in a separate video when we're going to be discussing cycles and Eevee specifically. I'm going to show you some tricks here with nodes, okay? So be careful with reflections, be careful with strength of light, because if your light is too strong, it's going to be really harsh. So like we discussed before, the size of light matters. So maybe if your light produces a lot of strong light, the way to go around it would be to make the light a little bit bigger. So you go here, grab the light, right? And if it's, if it's producing very strong light, make it a bit larger. It's going to dull it down a bit, because the area producing the light is going to increase as well, right? So increase the light, increase the strength, should improve a bit, okay? Now, occasionally, some of the reflections will be clipped, like for example here, that's a clipped reflection, okay? There's no detail here whatsoever. If you zoom in, it's pure white. That's okay, because that's how reflections behave in real life. However, you need to understand that you need to place these reflections in a way in your image they're going to be balanced. So for example, this area is balanced by this area, okay? And these two areas are balanced by the very warm area here, all right? So remember that if you have something really contrasty, even if it's blown out, which means the exposure is pushed too far, right? You can see here I have a warning, which means one of these areas here is overexposed, and I'll guarantee you it's this one. So you may want to off balance this with something else, okay? So occasionally, especially on round objects, it's going to be very difficult to remove the reflections or make them, you know, kind of appear dull, because then you would need to bring down the strength of light, and with that the entire scene is going to be very dark. So, you know, there are limitations to what you can do, right? But when you have such reflections, you need to think how to off-balance them with something else, because the image was, you know, completely dull and sort of there's no other elements to pull attention, and I would have this reflection here. This would be an imbalanced image, because, you know, attention will be going just to this engine without being pulled somewhere else. Okay, so remember that when you create this kind of a situation, make sure that you're going to off balance it with something. All right, so to sum it up, pay attention to your exposure, pay attention to your histogram. Okay, when you render something, always bring it to Photoshop, because it's a good chance that the image is gonna be too dark. Okay, so bring it to Photoshop, and if it's too dark, go back to Blender and render it again. Pump a bit more light, right? Make it brighter, because remember, in Photoshop, when you're gonna be editing, you're gonna be adding contrast. Contrast will always make shadows darker and highlights brighter. So if I'm gonna, for example, start adding contrast here, right? You will see that you know, my image is gonna become really punchy when this is going nuts. But you know, even a little bit, right? See, my shadows are much darker and my highlights are much brighter. So look what happens to histogram, okay, when I'm gonna turn it on and off. See what I mean? It's been pushed really hard here to the right side, and now I'm getting, you know, definitely I'm getting clipping here in this area. This is way too strong, okay? This area here on the left, this. So when you create a situation like that, you know, you will definitely have some crazy overexposed areas, and this is just way too contrasty, okay? Way too contrasty. So when you add contrast in your image, after you bring it to Photoshop, you always have to watch the histogram and make sure you're not gonna push it too far, okay? There's a really cool tool here for curves. You can click on this handle. You can choose, you know, tone in your image that you want to brighten up or darken down. And let's say I wanted to darken down this here, I'm gonna drag it down, and I want to brighten up this one, I'm gonna, you know, drag it up, you see. And this is far more better way of contrasting than just simply using this curve here, you know, willy-nilly, okay? Another thing is that when you're adding contrast, what you may want to do is change here these settings from normal to luminosity. This will only add contrast, but will not add saturation. Saturation I would add separately here by dropping down the saturation and increasing vibrance. Okay, so this is how I would colorize my image and make it a bit more punchy. So if I'm going to combine these two together, you'll see that it looks far more natural than the previous effect, right? So remember that when you work in Photoshop with contrast, exposure, colors, etc., always use multiple layers. Do it in steps. Do it slowly, okay? Don't do it everything in one layer. It's not a race, you know, it's a marathon, okay? Many layers. Just pace yourself. That's important, because it's very easy to overtune the image with, you know, with one layer of curves or something. It's impossible to do it properly in one layer.